So today I'm going to talk about part of this research, especially with support from the CCI. But just want to mention that this is a kind of a broader project that had multiple funding, but I will highlight the parts that we have developed through thanks to CCI funding. So as I guess the introduction already mentioned, my group, UVA DSA or Dependable Systems Analytics group, focuses on design and validation of safety critical CPS. Some of the examples of systems that we look at are like systems, AI assistance for emergency response, teleoperated surgical robots, artificial pancreas system for diabetes management, and we have also done some work in autonomous driving. So our work is very practical in nature. So I wanted to start with these examples, and I will use some of them throughout the talk. So our research in general takes a three-part basically approach, which is basically both data and model driven. On one hand, we actually look into real data, realistic incidents on safety and security to learn about how the systems fail and how humans operate devices. And gaining insight from that, we actually try to assess the resilience of the systems within realistic test beds. So one aspect of our work is on design of these test beds that actually not only have the cyber and physical, but also humans in the loop. And then the third part, which is actually the focus of my talk today, is on design of context-aware runtime assurance capabilities, meaning like the mechanisms that you can add to the existing CPS systems to make them capable of predicting the occurrence of any of the safety or security violations early on, and then try to recover from them or try to mitigate them, or like if that's not an option, try to provide assistance to the human operators before the accidents happen. So if you think about the CPS, I guess like a little bit of background. So at the core, the CPS are like basically control systems. There is a kind of we call it autonomous controller in this case, meaning that I'm just meaning a human. It could be like not machine learning enabled. That basically is responsible for sensing a physical phenomena or process, such as say a patient physiology or like some behavior, and then basically does some decision making and then sends commands to the actuators. In our research, we specifically focus on human in the loop CPS, meaning that in these control loops, whatever number of control loops we have that are automated, there are also a number of human operators that are involved that they might actually directly control the physical process or basically collaborate with the autonomous controller, or they might actually just send commands to the autonomous controller to control eventually the physical process. And this is a very kind of common basically model, especially medical CPS, as basically they require like a human in the loop to supervise and control the systems. So as we already know, like kind of with growing kind of complexity of the software and also like a lot of interconnectivity between different sensors with IoT, like different types of like cloud services and like kind of devices are getting connected to each other. And more recently with like adoption of AI and machine learning for perception and control, it's becoming more and more challenging to make sure that the cyber layer, like just the controller itself, is actually safe and secure. And one thing that adds a lot into this sort of challenges is like the notion of like resource and timing constraints. So if I have like say a kind of a timing deadline that I need to make a decision about the say a patient diagnosis or like making an action or providing feedback to the operator, that makes it even more challenging to ensure safety. But in addition to this sort of almost like traditional challenges, there are also like kind of these specific challenges when you're dealing with like kind of physical phenomena, especially like patients and humans as the control process, that you there are always like kind of this sort of diversity in like kind of operational scenarios. You have like patients that have different profiles, like different age, gender, coming from different backgrounds. The devices might be kind of used in different environmental environments. And that actually adds to the kind of the complexity, like how to design basically safety and security mechanisms that can actually be robust in this different variety of scenarios. And then one thing that I want to actually highlight today in the talk is actually the notion of human operators, especially medical CPS. Humans, like clinicians, like nurses, people who operate the devices, they're actually very involved and they usually have like kind of expertise and they follow a set of guidelines or like sort of like knowledge that they have built through a lot of education to operate devices or like kind of treat patients. So that's also a kind of a challenge, how we can actually bring that knowledge into a kind of safety and security kind of assurance. So in our work, we are specifically focused on medical CPS, and they're very, if you're familiar with them, like they're actually widespread. They're used everywhere, from personalized devices, wearable devices, to like hospital systems, and like more like imaging equipment. And specifically, three medical CPS that I mentioned at the beginning. And I want to highlight that in terms of like kind of levels of autonomy or how much machine learning or AI is actually adopted in these systems, these are very different from like other CPS. Most of the medical devices are still at like maybe even level zero of autonomy, meaning that there is no kind of autonomous action taken by a kind of the system. Usually ML or AI is actually just used for decision support. So the actuator is actually a human operator, like a physician or like a responder who is treating the patient. And then if there is any automation or like involvement of ML or AI, it's actually just to support them through some insights for decision making. The only example of like kind of a little bit of higher than that level is level one, that basically we have like teleoperated systems such as surgical robots, which is one of our main case studies, where a human operator is in the loop and is actually continuously operating the system and providing feedback. So both the robot and the human are actually controllers, but the human is actually the master controller. And then maybe one of the only examples of like fully autonomous systems that are currently on the market for medical domain are like kind of something like artificial pancreas systems, that basically you have a full loop of like sensing from a, say, CGM, and then kind of control through insulin pump. So these are like some of our three examples throughout the talk, and mainly like the first two, and I wanted to just have a quick introduction about them. So why we care about this, or what is this really important? Like kind of I just want to give some examples and numbers about this. Specifically with like medical devices, there are lots of different sources of like kind of vulnerabilities, both in terms of safety and security. So it would be like kind of accidental faults or human errors that are happening at random times, or it could be like malicious attackers that are intentionally attacking the system. And the goal at the end is that actually the goal of attacker, or like if it's an unintentional fault, is that actually unsafe control action is provided by the system that causes a harm, I mean, to the patient. And that's what we want to avoid. We want to kind of stop these unsafe control actions from being executed. So we have done a lot of previous work on like looking at real data. So these are just some older numbers, but this trend is actually continuing. Like there are lots of like kind of over thousands, like kind of like maybe every year, and also over the periods of the years. If you look on like kind of recalls that are posted to the FDA that are related to the computer failures or software issues that could be also kind of sources of attacks. So similar trends are actually seen, kind of increasing number of vulnerabilities are reported, specifically for medical devices. Public exploits are available that someone can actually attack a malicious party can kind of use it to cause safety issues. And I don't want to go through the details, but basically this trend continues to kind of happen even in 2023. There was reports that showing that across many different devices, there are like public exploits and vulnerabilities that could be a source of safety issues as well. Specifically for artificial pancreas systems, there were like over like 80 recalls over like the period that we analyzed, and then like over 1.6 million adverse events related to different devices. Not all of these are security issues, but if you think about it, some of them, even if it's a kind of unexpected fault, it could be actually leveraged by a kind of a malicious party to kind of cause the same kind of harm, something like kind of causing hypoglycemia, or like kind of making the pump not available or the system not available to a diabetic patient, and then potentially causing injury or death. So similar kind of a story for surgical robots, and these are like kind of the systems that are again, as I said, like they're connected to the hospital network, and usually kind of a surgeon in the room is controlling them. We have done again studies on the first part of our work showing like how these systems can actually be compromised by an attacker, or like even just unintended human errors can actually lead to the kind of system malfunction and causing potential harm to the patient. The most recent data that I want to kind of share, which is very new out of basically Owen, like 2025, is that we actually look at the FDA data on like how the new approved FDA, basically ML-enabled devices are performing. And as of 2025, like very recent kind of analysis we did, there are like over 1,000 FDA-approved ML devices that basically they're using ML AI for decision making in different medical specialties. And most of these, as I said, they're not like basically making control actions, they're just providing kind of support and decision making to the operators, especially like kind of to physicians in the office for imaging or other kind of functions. And our analysis shows that there, so far from 2015 until 2024, there are over 1,460 adverse events reported only for these ML-enabled devices. Again, of course, not all of these are related to the device itself. So if you go and dig into it, you need to kind of read the reports and understand what are the causes. But at least like a good, I mean, a 38% of like kind of these adverse events were kind of concerned with safety critical devices in radiology or like kind of general hospital, clinical chemistry, like artificial pancreas systems. And one thing that was very interesting came out was that over 60% of the kind of errors or like basically adverse events, bad experiences that the users and caregivers had with the systems were related to the interface of the system. Basically like poor quality input, inaccurate readings, and then false negative results. And these are usually kind of like places that actually can be compromised by attackers too. Somebody sending bad data, bad image, or poor readings to a medical device and then cause false negative results. So I just want to kind of bring this up to also mention that even with like kind of increasing use of machine learning, these actually issues are not resolved and it's actually they stay the same and it becomes actually more challenging to ensure safety because of like the same vulnerability existing in the devices. So what is state of the art in dealing with these issues? Some of the existing solutions, both in the literature and like kind of in practice, most of them basically focus on design time assurance techniques. So they try to do early on hazard analysis, threat modeling. Some works actually focus on modeling, verification, and synthesis. But then there is less attention paid in this category of the work into like what happens at runtime. What if like despite everything I've done, there is a kind of a residual fault that I didn't think about, an attacker and on the other hand, there are works also like kind of on runtime anomaly detection and recovery, not much in medical domain, but mainly like other CPS. But then most of them, they actually focus on, again, fully autonomous systems. So I have a drone or like kind of a ground vehicle, and basically I have an attack or fault, and then how I can actually recover from that. Most of these works, they don't consider the role of humans. What happens when the operator is in the loop, like controlling the medical device, and then something goes wrong? And how can I recover from it or have autonomous recovery action while the human is in the loop? And then the third basically gap in the existing solutions is that they're either completely model based or like based on rules and knowledge, or they're completely data driven based on machine learning. And then we know like the challenges of each of like the groups of this works, like the model based techniques usually, or the ones that are based on rule based, they cannot cover like the variety of the patient profiles. They cannot generalize well. They're not robust enough. On the other hand, for machine learning models, we need a lot of data. So, and on the other hand, they're not transparent. Usually, like manufacturers of medical devices don't share like what models they have, the training data they use, and we know like how sensitive machine learning models are to kind of the new test data seen in the field. So there are these kind of challenges on each side. So in our kind of research, we are trying to kind of bridge some of these gaps by taking a kind of approach that actually is in the middle of the two kind of the group of techniques. So we try to combine both basically data-driven methods and model-based techniques by using machine learning, but then try to kind of basically enforce some sort of safety properties or like kind of logic in the training process into or in the operation of the machine learning to encode the kind of the safety properties or security kind of constraints that we have to make sure that when we are checking for system resilience, we are not completely based on data. We are also like following the rules and like the models that we have for safety. And our focus is actually a broad range of like issues, ranging from again faults to malicious attacks or human errors. The cause is less of a concern. The more of the focus is on like how we can basically prevent the effect of this sort of events to become like kind of hazards and harm the patients. So going back to the kind of the CPS control loop, our approach is actually focuses on what we call context-aware runtime assurance and training. So we want to kind of early on, before these unsafe control actions are actually executed on a basically actuator and then cause a safety hazard in the physical layer, act on them and then try to correct them or stop them from happening. And this requires not only kind of autonomous actions, but also like coordination with the human operators because we have them in the loop. So the idea is that we want to augment the CPS with basically capabilities for error detection and recovery. And we call it like basically AI cognitive assistance because we are using machine learning AI and we are trying to assist the operators and also the system with new kind of cognitive capabilities, which is like error detection and anticipating for like hazards and recovering from them. And basically, the goal is that either we can actually provide automated kind of corrective actions to kind of stop the unsafe control action from happening or fix it, or if it's a kind of a human in the loop system, just provide feedback to the human operator as early as possible on how to fix their action or like how to stop the system to not cause harm. And like just to give a kind of two examples in case of like for example surgical robot when the surgeon is operating the robot. So here is a kind of a control software of the system, and then we want to basically augment the safety checks in the system with some additional kind of safety checking and monitoring and recovery at the last layer of like kind of control structure just before the actuators. And we basically want to kind of detect first what is happening in terms of activity, intention of the user, and then like some example of that you see in this video, try to provide that kind of feedback to the user about the error. So if like I can detect that, oh, the needle is going to drop early on, try to give an alert to the user or like try to even fix it as you see in these figures by suggesting a trajectory, saying that maybe you should take this trajectory to kind of achieve the a specific motion primitive that is kind of expected in this task. Another example from like kind of emergency response. So for example, we can provide the human operators in this case in a more like a decision support level 0 autonomy with like kind of like alerts or like kind of timely reminders about what actions they should take if we see that there is an unsafe action is going to happen, and then try to provide them reminders so that the kind of the task is completed in a safe manner. I'm going to kind of provide more basically details about how we achieve each of these two examples next throughout the talk. So first, let's look at like the overall approach that we take. So as in this specific kind of context, aware kind of runtime assurance and training, we have first a trust that is focusing on what is context. So basically how we can actually model the context for a CPS and formalize it in a way that the runtime monitoring and recovery techniques that we have, they can actually use that and integrate it with machine learning. So going back to our kind of figure of CPS, if you think about it, we have three layers of like kind of layers in our system. The human layer, that basically a human operator has some sort of like knowledge of like the task, like say an operation that is supposed to be executed using a surgical robot, say a suturing task within a kind of a larger operation in gynecology. And usually, like these operators, based on those workflows that they have learned through the time, especially medical domain, this is very common. They actually follow a set of guidelines or like a mental model of like how to do the tasks and actions. So one of the things that we need to understand when we want to do like safety monitoring is to kind of how first understand and characterize this sort of, we call it operational context, but also like how to model it and also detect it using our basically safety engine in order to kind of take the actions. In the cyber layer, this is more like traditional kind of safety security kind of checking. We need to kind of be able to understand like the state of the software, the hardware, the control system. Basically, our safety checkers should be kind of aware of like kind of basically the control commands that are being kind of issued in the cyber layer, the safety of like the kind of sensory input values. This is more like kind of traditional kind of software safety and cyber layer. But also like on the physical side, if you think about it, at the end when the control actions are performed, they're going to change something in the physical state. For example, they're going to change the robotic arms to kind of the position of the end effectors on the arms to carry the needle to push it through a tissue. So one of the things that also we want to do, which is new, like the operational context, is that how we can actually model this sort of physical context. And this has been done in previous research, but more importantly, how to connect it to the operational context. So if I know what the intention of the human operator is the physical context or the final outcome from the execution of the commands, is it like kind of representative of what the human basically operational context had in mind? So a kind of like a mapping and cross-checking between like the human operational context, or like what we predict the human is going to do, and what is happening in the physical layer. So I want to kind of next talk about our work on like how we model, especially this operational and physical context, as because these are the new aspects. Again, cyber context has been done in a related work. and also how we actually detect this basically context in very real time for detection and recovery. So in case of like surgical robot, again, because we are talking about like kind of domain specific operations, like every kind of domain or like basically expertise has their own kind of set of guidelines. We have done a lot of work in like kind of collecting real world data, both in like simulation, like when operators are doing kind of training, or like in basically real surgical procedures, in order to understand how an operation actually kind of is performed. And we have taken a more kind of a computer science approach into modeling it. We call it like kind of a hierarchical modeling of an operational context by breaking down every surgical procedure or like any kind of medical procedure into like a smaller steps or tasks that they can actually broken down further to kind of a smaller activities that are actually universal. So if you actually go to the motion level or gesture level, these are very universal motions, like kind of like push, pull, kind of grasp. And you can basically using this sort of modeling, basically model any sort of data set or task that you have in surgery into like this framework, and then try to define some sort of rules and like safety properties on top of it. Similarly, like kind of again similar concept, just to show two examples in emergency response. We have done like kind of a literature review based on like kind of established guidelines in order to kind of break down the kind of the tasks that the kind of responders do in the field into like different protocols, interventions that they do, and then each of their steps or activities that they do within each intervention. So again, similar kind of approach in trying to kind of formalize the activities in order to define safety properties for them. Then one more thing that we do is that we actually have this sort of mapping, as I said, between the operational and the physical context. So we try to kind of model how each of the actions or like basic motion primitives that the human operators or like kind of the actual basically system takes, the control system, will affect the physical layer. So if I, for example, go and like grasp a needle, how the status of the needle in the physical layer change, and if I can actually detect the basically from say computer vision the physical state of the needle or the thread and interactions between them, I can also infer if this is reflective of the action that the human operator or the system was going to establish. So I can almost like define pre and post conditions on the basically states for each of the actions that are being performed by the system. One of the challenges, if you note here, is that in both of these works and in general in medicine, we need a lot of data in order to kind of verify these models. And there is actually a lot of like previous work in surgery or like EMS that they have actually just from like kind of the knowledge kind of aspect of it, they have shown that these are like kind of the acceptable models. But one aspect of our work is actually dealing with like collecting and labeling data from real world, basically training simulation experiments. And this is specifically a part that this CCI kind of funding actually supported us throughout the last couple of years in order to build actually data collection systems that basically integrate multimodal sensing in order to kind of collect data, we call it contextual data, from simulation, from like the tasks that the kind of different medical operators do in order to kind of train themselves on different operations. And using this data, we try to do this basically further verification and modeling of the operational context I talked about. Here you see an example of the kind of simulations we have done with EMS agencies in local to Charlottesville and also in Virginia, that we actually collect multimodal data from like simulated EMS calls, such as like chest pain, and one of the responders is playing the role of a patient, others are operating. So once we have this data and like we have this kind of models from the knowledge sources, then the next stage is like how we can actually use this in order to kind of define properties or like kind of safety rules that we want to kind of check at runtime, or like basically augment our machine learning models to follow them at runtime. So we use a system storytelling approach for that, which is from like kind of an approach by Nancy Leveson from MIT, which we try to kind of model accidents as like kind of this sort of violation of safety constraints. Our interest is actually on identifying like what are the set of states or like this sort of contextual kind of states that we've talked about, that under them a specific control actions actually might lead to hazards, or basically what is defined as unsafe control action. So in order to do that, first we basically try to define for a specific system what are the all possible set of unsafe control actions using a hazard analysis approach. This is something that any design basically team does it anyway for a system. And basically, we try to kind of formalize it using signal temporal logic. So basically, starting with a set of accidents and hazards, we try to define a set of system states and actions, and basically using the state variables that under those states, these specific actions will lead to the accidents or hazards. This is an example from artificial pancreas system to just give you an idea. So for example, for an artificial pancreas system that is used for diabetes management, we want to make sure that the insulin dose that is provided by the pump to the patient is not too high or too low. And that depends on a lot of like contextual factors. What is the physiology of the patient? What is the current level of BG that the patient has or insulin on board? So two things that we want to avoid is that in terms of hazards is that we don't want to give too much insulin when which might lead to kind of hypoglycemia, or we don't want to give too little insulin, which might lead to kind of hyperglycemia. So we try to kind of then go and identify examples of scenarios or like basically using this sort of STPA approach on safe control actions that might kind of lead to these situations. For example, I can write when the BG is low and like the it's keeping decreasing over time, and basically insulin on board is more than some threshold beta. Then if we keep providing insulin value, then it is very likely that we might provide too much, and it actually leads to a kind of hypoglycemia scenario. As I said, this is a kind of a very standard approach that is in hazard analysis is done. The only thing that we are doing here is that we are trying to kind of formalize it using the state variables and basically using signal temporal logic. So once we have this sort of like basically set of unsafe control actions, we try to kind of transform them into a kind of STL formulas that basically then can be implemented as monitors or like kind of be verified using kind of safety checkers. And here's an example of like the set of STL properties that we have identified for an artificial pancreas system. As you see here, every kind of rule or like kind of set of properties that we have, they're defining like a kind of the predicates that they say which state or like basic context, in this case, just physical context, and what actions will lead to what kind of hazards. And one thing that you will see here is that basically we have a lot of like kind of parameters like betas that are unknown. And that's the part that actually needs kind of data or machine learning. So basically for different kind of patients or like kind of physiology or profiles, we can actually rely on some fixed rules, or we can actually try to learn or adjust the parameters in this sort of safety properties based on patient data. And that's the approach that we take here. So the way that we actually combine logic formulas with the data. So we have two approaches. One thing is that one approach for combining this sort of knowledge or like basically safety rules with data is that after we have this sort of set of STL properties, we try to use a STL learning approach to learn the unknown parameters beta that you see in this kind of rules from simulation traces from like a kind of a closed loop CPS testbed that has both faulty and fault-free basically data traces. The faulty traces are important because we want to make sure that we cover also examples that basically an unsafe control action was there and then actually led to a hazard. So we want to learn the betas for both good and bad basically data. And we actually, in our previous work, we proposed a kind of a specific kind of a tighter kind of loss function for like STL learning, which basically uses like kind of very similar STL approach which is to a state of the art, but like a tighter loss function. And basically what we try to achieve using this approach is that we are trying to find basically the boundary between safe and unsafe regions, or basically when I can say that unsafe, basically that's the time that a control action is unsafe, learning a threshold. But we are trying to kind of have under approximating the safe region while over approximating the unsafe region. So for example, we are trying to say when BG is less than a target and IOB is more than some threshold beta that we are learning here, then increasing the insulin is unsafe. A second approach that we have actually tried, and both of these actually have been compared to each other in our previous work, is actually to encode the logic formulas that we have, like or safety properties, as customized loss functions into the machine learning. So we actually can alternatively try with a kind of just a machine learning model that tries to predict the occurrence of the hazards if we have a data set that includes both safe and unsafe situations. And then once we have that machine learning model, which is based on some like limited data, like on a patient or population of the patients, We can also like kind of do kind of a second round of training with a customized loss function that has an additional term with the logic formulas that basically we are saying that whenever the logic formulas and the machine learning model predictions they don't agree with each other, we try to penalize the kind of the training or the loss function during the training process. And then we have actually compared these two techniques both with the customized loss functions and kind of the STL learning approach in our previous work. One thing that we have shown is that basically these both of them actually lead to a better satisfaction of safety properties, and they actually achieve more interpretability of like ML monitors like than just black box models that you don't know what they're doing, and they can lead to better accuracy. So once basically this kind of a specification of the properties and the learning is done, then actually the last stage is that how we can actually synthesize the monitor to actually do the monitoring and recovery at real time. And for that, basically, what the goal is that we want to kind of implement basically these logic formulas or that machine learning model. But in any case, we want to kind of check at every basically window of time of the measurements if the logic formulas that we have or safety properties are satisfying or not. And in order to do that, basically, we need to have what we call a context inference capabilities that we can actually in real time, almost kind of in parallel to the controller itself, do some level of a state estimation in order to predict the context. So as I talked before, this context actually includes both like operational and kind of physical context. So it's not really kind of a straightforward to just basically go and like kind of get those from the sensors directly. Sometimes we need to actually have additional machine learning models in order to detect the context. A good example of that is in robotic surgery. So as you remember, I talked about like the notion of operational context. So we want to understand at each point in time when I'm checking those safety rules, what is the kind of the operational context, or like say the action that the human is taking. So we have developed techniques that we can in real time. The real time part is very important because most of the state of the art techniques, they cannot achieve real time performance. So we try to kind of develop techniques that in a very fast kind of time, they can detect what is the current task or like kind of the action or gesture. Basically, both coarse grain and fine grain actions are performed by the human or the robot or basically the controller, and then try to use that as basically context or like kind of the information to check our safety rules. Here you see an example of like for the surgical robot that basically we try to detect the gestures or segment the task into different gestures. And also we try to detect the interactions between the tools and objects, which is actually related to the gestures that are being performed. So just mapping between the operational and physical context. In order to do this, kind of we have developed different models. One of them that performed the best was a kind of transformer-based model that was multimodal, relying on both kinematic and vision data in order to kind of predict, first recognize what's the actual gesture that is performed at each point in time for a 1 second window of time, and also predict what are the future gestures are going to perform and actually generate the optimal trajectories for them. Here's a demo of the kind of the performance of this technique. As you see, basically as the task is being performed in a simulation environment, we can detect basically what gesture is being performed. The G8 is actually one of the gestures in this task, which is a suturing task in a simulation environment. And basically we do both segmentation, try to basically both detect the type of the gesture and also the beginning and end of the segment, which is very important to kind of then apply the safety rules at the time window of the gesture. Then one more thing we do is at the lower level is that we try to detect the interactions between the tools and kind of objects. In this case, is a kind of artificial tissue. So basically, we use a combination of semantic segmentation with context detection. These are based on a set of the artwork on detecting like the location of the end effectors, the needle, the thread, and also when these basically tools and objects are interacting with each other based on like overlaps and contour detection. And we basically try to detect a state, like basically right now, like left grasper is touching the needle or the right grasper is pushing like kind of the needle through the tissue. So these are like for more verification on the physical layer that the cyber layer and the operational layer kind of actions are performed correctly. So a similar kind of work is going on for our emergency response project, just kind of to again show another application of this. There we are dealing with multimodal data, as I said. We don't have kinematics, but we have video, audio, and a smartwatch data. And then we try to kind of again detect activities at different levels of hierarchy. So at one level, we basically based on audio data that is transcribed into text, we try to detect what is the current protocol, like basically like equivalent of operation robotic surgery that the responder is performing. And then in each part of the protocol, this approach is also based on transformers and graph transformers. And then in each of the protocols, we try to kind of break down further what is the actual action or intervention that is being performed. Is it like, for example, CPR or like mask insertion? And then in each basically intervention, what are the key steps that are being performed? And the nice thing about this work is that basically we are doing it using both fully supervised and zero shot models and then comparing them to see if we can achieve like the similar performance using maybe few shot learning rather than like fully supervised techniques, which will actually address some of the challenges with data collection and labeling. And the last part is that once we basically detected basically the context and we have the safety rules, we know what we want to kind of detect. We basically go and like combine these sort of rules and like context inference with some basically runtime detection and recovery. So in this case, also we use multimodal data. So either the activity data from kinematics of the robot or from the smartwatch movements. And then also computer vision video is always part of it. And then we try to kind of use different machine learning models that they have the knowledge of the task. For example, they already know based on the context inference, this is gesture number one, or this is a kind of the a specific task in EMS. And they basically learn the specific safety properties and that we had before from the data and then combine it with our knowledge rules in order to detect that any errors is happening or not. So here is an example of the same task. I think I showed this early on that basically using just kinematic data, we are detecting the occurrence of the errors. This is actually not predictive. It actually sometimes happens a little bit afterwards. So like things like multiple attempt or needle drop and so on. And like our experimental results show that actually this technique of combining knowledge with data, in this case for error detection, is more effective than just not having any knowledge of the task. So basically showing some proof and evidence that combining the notion of context or activity with error detection is actually helpful. And then in our more latest work, we are trying to combine the same notion for recovery. So if you go back to the example of the surgical robot, like we have a surgeon sending the commands over the network or some link to the robot to perform some operation. What we do is that we basically augment the control system of the robot with this sort of recovery framework that you see here that basically does the all these steps I talked about. It does actually activity recognition in order to know what is the kind of current task that is being performed. It does some level of trajectory prediction to say what is the kind of the ideal path that should be taken. And then it has a kind of a dual mode recovery that to kind of based on if the kind of the effect of the fault of the, or attack is short term or long term, it can switch to a kind of a completely machine learning method like transformer based, or it can switch to a kind of model-based technique based on dynamic motion primitives. So in this basically basically this is the most recent one that actually combines this again notion of model and data for recovery, and you see an example of like applying this technique to a case of like having packet loss. Basically, the input that is coming from the surgeon to the robot is actually being faulty or like being dropped by an attacker or just network conditions. And you see an example here that like at some point during this trajectory, we have an error happening at this point. And then after that point, basically our recovery module takes effect in order to kind of generate a good trajectory for the robot to take. We have two options. We can either show the ideal trajectory like through some sort of suggestion as you see here to the operator to say like you need to do this if there is not complete kind of disconnection. But if we detect that there is a complete disconnection between the robot and the human operator, we can actually try to generate this trajectory automatically so that the robot can continue basically as you see the trajectory, which is the dotted one, and then finish it very similar to the ground truth trajectory that the human operator had in mind. And then our again comparison between like model-based technique based on just kind of Kalman filter or just machine learning transformer model versus like kind of a dynamic model-based approach. shows that like our dual mode kind of recovery technique that is using both transformer and kind of motion primitives actually is the closest kind of in terms of or it has the least amount of error in terms of trajectory to the ground truth. You see the Kalman filter, which is a state-of-the-art technique used by some previous work. And here you see a kind of the performance across different kind of motion primitives, again, showing that for every action, given knowing that what the action is, our recovery technique actually can do very good in terms of like kind of amount of error that it achieves in predicting the trajectories and fixing the errors. Yeah, so with that, I want to kind of summarize overall this work that we take a hybrid knowledge and data-driven technique to design of monitors and safety engines that can detect and prevent hazards and basically provide assistance to the operators and devices. And we still are continuing this work thanks to the support from CCI, especially on collecting more data, multimodal data, and labeling of that, using basically including both faulty and fault-free data. And especially like the work on human cyber physical modeling is still going on. How we can, once we got the data, we can actually label and model it for different operations and then physical kind of states, either in EMS or robotic surgery. And also this sort of context-aware mitigation and recovery that I talked about at the end is part of our work. All the test beds and data sets I actually talked about are available publicly on a GitHub, UVA DSA, and other researchers can use them if they want to do similar simulation experiments or data sets to be used. And I want to kind of acknowledge the contribution of like the great graduate students in our group from computer engineering and electrical engineering, and funding support beyond CCI from NIST and also NSF and also UVA Health System. And also many thanks to Link Lab for providing us the great facilities, and our collaborators like the robotic surgeons and EMS responders. They actually help us with this data collection from simulated training experiments and to test the system in the lab or like in their basically setup.